Have you ever wondered if Buddhism is just an ancient philosophy, something distant and irrelevant to our fast-moving modern lives? Maybe you think it's tied to old temples, monks in robes, or meditative practices that require hours of solitude, luxuries few of us have today. The truth is, many people ask the same question: is Buddhism suitable for modern people? This question cuts to the heart of a larger conversation. How can a tradition that began over 2,500 years ago still hold meaning in a world dominated by smartphones, social media, instant news, and endless distractions? Can the wisdom of the Buddha really help us navigate the challenges of modern life, the stress, the anxiety, the constant rush to keep up? To answer this, we need to take a step back and look closely at what Buddhism truly teaches, and more importantly, how those teachings can be a guiding light for us today. No matter how chaotic life gets, Buddhism is often misunderstood as a religion of renunciation, of escaping the world. But at its core, it's a practical philosophy, deeply rooted in understanding the nature of suffering and how to end it. It offers a pathway to peace, clarity, and freedom that's as relevant now as it was in the ancient forests where the Buddha first sat in meditation. In this series, we'll explore Buddhism's timeless wisdom and its powerful tools, like mindfulness and compassion, that can transform how we live, work, and relate to each other in the 21st century. We'll dive into how these teachings address the universal human experience, the desire to find meaning, to reduce suffering, and to live with greater ease. But here's something to keep in mind: Buddhism is not a one-size-fits-all formula. It is a living, breathing tradition that has evolved over millennia, adapting to different cultures and times. Today, it's being reinterpreted and integrated in ways that make it accessible for busy professionals, parents, students, and anyone seeking balance amidst the noise of modern life. Throughout this journey, we will hear stories from real people who have found profound transformation through Buddhist practices, people juggling careers, family responsibilities, and personal growth. These stories show us that Buddhism isn't about withdrawing from the world, it's about fully engaging with it. But with wisdom and compassion, at the same time, we won't shy away from the challenges Buddhism faces today: the risk of oversimplification, commercialization, or misinterpretation. It's important to approach these teachings with honesty and depth, so we don't lose the profound essence beneath the surface. So, is Buddhism suitable for modern people? The answer is both simple and complex. It requires an open mind, a willingness to explore, and a deep dive into what it means to live wisely in today's world. To understand why Buddhism remains deeply relevant to modern life, we must first explore its core teachings, principles that have guided countless individuals on a path from suffering to freedom for over 2 millennia. These teachings are not dusty relics of a distant past but living wisdom that addresses the fundamental human experience. At the heart of Buddhism lie the Four Noble Truths, a simple yet profound framework that acts like a clear diagnosis of the human condition. Imagine waking every day carrying invisible burdens, stress from work, emotional pain, subtle dissatisfaction lurking beneath moments of joy. The Buddha recognized this pervasive unease and offered insight into its nature. The first truth, the truth of suffering, acknowledges that life as we commonly experience it includes various forms of suffering, whether physical pain, emotional sorrow, or the general sense that things are never quite as perfect as we want. This suffering is not meant to be pessimistic but realistic. It is the universal experience of impermanence, loss, and change. But why do we suffer? The second truth points to craving and attachment as the root causes. Our minds cling to fleeting things, whether possessions, relationships, or ideas, believing they will bring lasting happiness. Yet because everything changes, this grasping inevitably leads to disappointment and pain. The good news comes in the third truth: suffering can cease. This is the promise of liberation, the possibility of freedom from the endless cycle of craving and dissatisfaction. By letting go of attachment, one can awaken to a peace that does not depend on external circumstances, a state called nirvana. Finally, the Buddha offered a clear path to this freedom, the Eightfold Path. Far from being a rigid set of rules, this path is a practical guide for living wisely and compassionately in the world. It is divided into three areas: wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. In the realm of wisdom, right view and right intention invite us to see life clearly and cultivate intentions rooted in kindness and harmlessness. Ethical conduct, including right speech, right action, and right livelihood, encourages integrity in how we communicate, behave, and earn a living. Mental discipline, through right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, trains the mind to be present, focused, and calm. In today's world, overwhelmed by distraction and endless noise, the Eightfold Path offers a much-needed compass to navigate life consciously. It teaches us to act with awareness, to live with purpose, and to cultivate inner peace regardless of external turmoil. Another essential teaching is the concept of impermanence, the understanding that all things are transient, in constant flux. Modern society often convinces us that happiness comes from acquiring more wealth, more recognition, more possessions. Yet Buddhism teaches that clinging to these impermanent things only deepens our suffering. Instead, learning non-attachment, an open, flexible way of relating to life, frees us from the fear of loss and disappointment. This does not mean becoming indifferent or cold, but rather embracing life's changes with grace and acceptance. Imagine the relief in knowing that change is natural and inevitable, so we need not fear the loss or endings that life brings. These timeless teachings matter profoundly in our modern context. Whether we're rushing through busy schedules, grappling with uncertainty, or navigating complex relationships, the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path provide practical tools. They help us recognize suffering without denial, cultivate ethical and compassionate living, and develop mindfulness that grounds us in the present moment. Ultimately, Buddhism is not about escaping life but engaging with it fully, awake, aware, and wise. As we continue, we'll explore how these ancient insights meet modern challenges and inspire real transformation in the lives of everyday people. In the whirlwind of today's world, many of us feel overwhelmed, pulled in 1,000 directions by work deadlines, social obligations, digital distractions, and the pressure to always be on. Stress, anxiety, and burnout have become familiar companions for millions. It's easy to feel lost, disconnected, and exhausted in this relentless race, but what if there was a way to meet these challenges with calm clarity and strength? This is where the ancient wisdom of Buddhism reveals its modern power. Modern life presents unique challenges, but many of them stem from basic human struggles that Buddhism has been addressing for centuries. Consider stress and anxiety, which often arise when our minds get caught up in worries about the future or regrets from the past. Our culture's constant emphasis on productivity and achievement can lead to burnout, feeling drained and empty despite external success. Buddhism teaches us that the root of much of this suffering lies in attachment and aversion, clinging to how we want things to be, and resisting how things actually are. When we hold tightly to expectations or push against reality, we create internal tension. One of Buddhism's most powerful responses to this tension is the practice of mindfulness, the art of paying attention, on purpose, to the present moment without judgment. Mindfulness invites us to slow down and notice what's happening inside and around us, the breath, the sensations in the body, the thoughts passing through the mind. This simple yet profound practice has been widely embraced in recent decades, not just in meditation centers but also in hospitals, schools, and workplaces. Scientific studies confirm what Buddhist practitioners have long known: mindfulness reduces stress, improves focus, and enhances emotional resilience. Take the story of Emma, a busy corporate executive. For years, she juggled a high-pressure job, family responsibilities, and the constant ping of her smartphone. Anxiety and sleepless nights were her norm. Then she began practicing mindfulness meditation, starting with just 5 minutes a day. Over time, Emma learned to observe her stress without being overwhelmed by it. She became more present with her colleagues and children and found a new sense of balance. Emma's story illustrates how Buddhist tools are not about retreating from the world but engaging with it more skillfully. Another key Buddhist teaching is compassion, a deep empathy for the suffering of ourselves and others. In a fragmented, competitive society, cultivating compassion reconnects us with our shared humanity. It encourages ethical behavior, generosity, and kindness, which research shows not only benefits others but also nourishes our own well-being. Buddhism's emphasis on ethical living, right speech, right action, right livelihood, reminds us that how we interact with the world matters deeply. In a time when many feel disconnected and isolated, ethical choices build trust, community, and meaning. The modern workplace, often seen as a source of stress, can become a ground for practicing these principles. Mindfulness helps us stay calm under pressure, compassion improves teamwork and leadership. Ethical living fosters respect and integrity. Yet, Buddhism also acknowledges that modern life's challenges are complex and multilayered. Technology connects us instantly but can also fragment our attention and create feelings of loneliness. The constant barrage of information makes it easy to get lost in worry or distraction. Here, Buddhism invites a radical shift, not by rejecting technology or modernity, but by transforming our relationship to them. Instead of mindlessly scrolling through social media, mindfulness teaches us to choose what we engage with consciously. Instead of reacting impulsively, compassion encourages thoughtful responses. This balance, between engagement and awareness, is the essence of the Buddhist approach to modern challenges. In a world that constantly reinvents itself, through technology, science, and social evolution, many traditions struggle to stay relevant. Yet Buddhism, with roots tracing back over 2,600 years, continues to speak powerfully to the modern mind. Why? Because at its heart, Buddhism is not a rigid system of beliefs, but a living, breathing way of understanding life. It is adaptable. It is resilient. And most importantly, it is deeply human. As the world shifts, so too does the way the Dharma expresses itself. Just as water takes the shape of the container it is poured into, Buddhist teachings have flowed into the containers of modern society, reshaping themselves while preserving their essence. The result? A beautiful and organic integration of ancient wisdom with contemporary life. Consider the story of May, a second-generation immigrant growing up in New York. Raised in a Buddhist household, she often struggled to connect the chants and temple visits of her childhood with the realities of her fast-paced urban life. Between college stress, identity confusion, and digital overload, she often felt unanchored. But everything began to change when she stumbled upon a YouTube channel led by a young monk who spoke not in lofty philosophical terms, but in the language of her daily struggles, anxiety, loneliness, uncertainty. Through a screen, she learned to breathe again. To sit still. To observe her thoughts rather than chase or resist them. For the first time, she realized that the Dharma wasn't something ancient and far away, it was right here, alive in her suffering and her healing. What had once felt like a cultural remnant became a personal refuge. And it didn't matter that she wasn't in a monastery, her room became her temple. Her cushion became her sacred ground. This is the face of modern Buddhism, not limited to robes and rituals, but woven into the fabric of daily life. Across the globe, Buddhist practice has leapt beyond traditional temples, finding new homes in hospitals, schools, offices, and even smartphones. In meditation apps and Zoom sanghas, people find connection in calm. What began as forest retreats and silent caves has now expanded into virtual retreats and mindfulness-based therapy. Some may worry that this is a dilution of the teachings. But perhaps it's not dilution, it's translation. The heart of Buddhism remains unchanged, to understand suffering and the path to its cessation. What changes is how it is spoken, practiced, and embodied. Just as the Buddha once adapted his message to farmers, warriors, and kings, modern teachers adapt the Dharma to therapists, tech workers, artists, and activists. In recent decades, the emergence of engaged Buddhism, led by figures like Thich Nhat Hanh, has shown how spiritual practice and social action can walk hand in hand. Rather than retreating from the world's problems, engaged Buddhists step into them, with compassion, awareness, and courage. They protest violence without hatred. They care for the environment not from fear, but from deep reverence for interbeing. It's a powerful reminder, Buddhism doesn't ask us to escape the world. It asks us to transform how we live in it. This spirit of transformation is also breaking traditional boundaries. In monasteries and dharma centers, more and more women are being recognized as teachers and leaders. In online sanghas, people of all races, genders, and identities gather as equals, united not by background, but by a shared aspiration to awaken. Buddhism, once largely transmitted through Asian lineages, is now taking root in the West, adapting language, imagery, and practices to reach hearts across the globe. And technology? Rather than rejecting it, many Buddhist teachers are learning to walk alongside it, with mindfulness. They teach us not to fear our phones or the internet, but to relate to them wisely. To pause before reacting. To scroll with awareness. To use digital tools not for distraction, but for connection and growth. Even in a hyper-connected world, they remind us, we can always come back to the breath. What we are witnessing is not the modernization of Buddhism, but the realization that Buddhism was always modern, because it speaks to the human condition at any time, in any place. When we look closely, we see that Buddhism isn't simply surviving in the modern world, it's evolving with it. It's being reborn, again and again, in the lives of those who dare to live more mindfully, more compassionately, more awake. It's found in the silence of meditation halls and the chaos of city streets. It's in the stillness of a monk's breath and the gentle awareness of a mother holding her crying child, and so, the Dharma continues, not as a relic of the past, but as a path of transformation that flows, adapts, and shines with relevance, right here, right now. In the sacred texts, we read of monks meditating beneath trees, of noble truths uttered under the Bodhi tree, and of serene temples nestled in the quiet of distant mountains. But today, the stories of awakening are unfolding in the middle of traffic jams, in office cubicles, in therapy sessions, and in tiny apartments lit by phone screens. These are not ancient stories, they are the stories of our time. And they remind us that the Dharma is not confined to robes or rituals, it is alive in the hearts of ordinary people living extraordinary inner journeys. Let us return to May, the young woman from New York who grew up surrounded by Buddhist images but never understood their meaning. Her awakening did not come in a monastery but on a crowded subway, headphones in, listening to a guided meditation on impermanence. Her panic attacks had grown more frequent, and therapy alone wasn't helping. One day, something in that calm voice on her app said, "You are not your thoughts. You are the space that holds them." She paused. That space, that gap between stimulus and response, became her sanctuary. Over time, she began meditating before exams, observing her mind with compassion, and embracing even her anxiety as a teacher. Buddhism did not erase her suffering. It helped her hold it gently. David was a high-performing executive, always on the go, always competing. Success looked like million-dollar deals and packed calendars. But one night, after collapsing from exhaustion, he sat in his hospital bed and asked a strange question: what am I running from? That question led him to a weekend mindfulness retreat. It was awkward at first, he wasn't used to silence or being alone with his mind. But by the second day, he began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: stillness. He wept, not out of sadness, but relief. Today, David runs his company differently. Meetings begin with a minute of silence. His leadership is no longer rooted in fear, but in presence. He once chased productivity. Now, he cultivates clarity. Buddhism didn't make him quit his career. It made him come back to it with a new heart. Amina fled civil war with her children, leaving everything behind. In the crowded tents of a refugee camp, peace felt like an impossible dream. But a visiting social worker introduced her to a simple breathing practice from a Buddhist-inspired trauma program. Breathe in, feel the ground. Breathe out, release the fear. At first, she resisted. What could breathing do against trauma? But night after night, as she rocked her child to sleep, she breathed consciously. Slowly, she felt her body soften. Her grief was still there, but now it had room to breathe. In time, she began sharing the practice with other mothers. She became a pillar of quiet strength. Her temple was her heart. Her sangha was her sisters in suffering. Tom's life had been a spiral of addiction and regret. After his third stint in rehab, someone handed him a book by Thich Nhat Hanh. One line hit him like lightning: no mud, no lotus. For the first time, he saw his suffering not as a curse, but as soil for growth. He began attending a local mindfulness group. He didn't know the chants or Buddhist terms, but he knew how to sit and breathe. Slowly, he learned to observe his cravings instead of obeying them. He slipped up, fell, but kept returning to the cushion. Today, he mentors others in recovery. His story is not one of perfection, it's one of perseverance. Buddhism didn't promise him bliss. It gave him tools to begin again, moment by moment. These stories are not extraordinary. And that is precisely why they are so powerful. They show us that awakening is not reserved for saints or sages. It is possible for anyone, in any place, at any stage of life. Whether you're a tech worker or teacher, a student or a retiree, a parent or a prisoner, the Dharma is available. It is as close as your breath. It lives in the space between reaction and response. It hides in the ordinary and flowers through your willingness to meet each moment with awareness. Modern practitioners teach us this truth. Buddhism is not about escaping the world, it's about entering it fully, with clarity and compassion. You don't need to shave your head or renounce everything. You need only the courage to pause, to look within, and to trust that even in your suffering, there is something sacred unfolding. Their stories are your invitation, not to become someone else, but to come home to yourself. While modern Buddhism has blossomed in unexpected and beautiful ways, reaching corporate boardrooms, college dorms, and digital spaces, it is not without its critics, and not without its challenges. Like any living tradition adapting to a rapidly changing world, it must navigate difficult questions. What happens when ancient wisdom meets a consumer-driven society? Can the Dharma survive in the age of ego branding, fast content, and spiritual shortcuts? To move forward with integrity, we must pause and reflect, not to condemn, but to understand. One of the most common criticisms today is that Buddhism is being watered down into mere stress relief. In many places, mindfulness is taught without ethics, compassion, or context. A breathing technique becomes just another productivity hack. Corporations adopt mindfulness workshops not to help employees awaken, but to make them more efficient under pressure. There's a story of a man who attended an expensive executive mindfulness retreat. He meditated, listened to talks, and practiced silence. But when asked afterward what he had learned, he said, "It helped me sharpen my negotiation tactics." He had become calmer, yes, but only to dominate more skillfully. This is not wrong, but it is incomplete. True mindfulness, in Buddhist tradition, is not merely about calm, it's about insight. It's seeing clearly into the nature of reality, into suffering and its causes. It is inseparable from ethics, compassion, and liberation. Without these, mindfulness risks becoming a self-soothing product instead of a path to freedom. The market has found Buddhism. From Buddha-shaped incense burners to designer meditation cushions, from TikTok monks to 10-step enlightenment courses, spirituality is now a brand. While this has helped make the teachings more visible, it has also led to what Tibetan teacher Chogyam Trungpa called spiritual materialism, the ego's ability to use even spirituality to reinforce itself. A person may meditate daily, wear mala beads, post spiritual quotes online, and still act from greed, pride, or ignorance. Buddhism is not about how we appear. It is about how we live. This is not a new problem. Even in the Buddha's time, there were those who wore robes for status or recited scriptures without understanding. But today, with algorithms rewarding performance over authenticity, the challenge has grown louder. The path now requires even more vigilance. As Buddhism adapts to modern life, another tension emerges. How far can we innovate before we lose the essence? some traditionalists worry that removing rituals, chanting, or monastic discipline weakens the Dharma. They fear that teachings are being simplified into pop psychology. On the other hand, progressives argue that rigid forms repel younger generations, and that clinging to outdated cultural expressions can make Buddhism inaccessible. Both sides carry truth. Traditions root us. Innovations help us grow. The real task is not choosing one over the other, but honoring the essence while reshaping the form. Just as a seed must break to sprout, traditions must sometimes crack open for wisdom to spread, but this cracking must come with care, with deep listening and respect for the lineages that carried the Dharma through centuries of war, exile, and persecution. Wisdom must evolve, not be exploited. Another difficult issue is the way Buddhism has been adopted, sometimes superficially, by predominantly Western audiences, often without acknowledgement of its Asian roots. For many Asian Buddhists, it is painful to see practices that were once mocked or exoticized now being repackaged and sold back to the world, stripped of cultural nuance and sacredness. Imagine growing up being told your temple visits were strange, only to later see your white classmates wearing Buddhist tattoos and quoting Zen on Instagram. The Dharma belongs to everyone, but gratitude and humility demand that we honor its cultural heritage. True integration must go beyond aesthetics. It must involve listening to Asian voices, preserving lineages, and understanding the lived context of the teachings, not just their polished summaries. No community is free from human flaws, including the Buddhist world. In recent years, several sanghas have faced scandals involving power abuse, sexual misconduct, and financial exploitation by teachers. These wounds run deep. They shake trust. They cause immense harm, but Buddhism teaches us to look clearly, even when it hurts. These incidents are not the failure of Buddhism itself, they are the failure of people to live the teachings fully. They are a call to greater transparency, accountability, and ethical integrity. Modern Buddhism must grow not just in popularity, but in maturity. Sanghas must create safe spaces. Teachers must embody what they preach. And practitioners must be encouraged to ask hard questions, not to destroy the tradition, but to protect its integrity. In a world of 15-second reels and dopamine-driven content, deep practice is hard. True transformation doesn't come from one quote or one guided meditation. It comes from years of returning, falling, and rising again. But many today are conditioned for speed, not depth. This leads to what some call spiritual grazing, jumping from one teaching to another, never digesting any of them. Buddhism invites us to slow down, to stay, to root. It asks us not to collect experiences, but to deepen awareness. The challenge is not only external. It is internal. Can we resist the urge to rush through the path? Can we endure silence long enough to hear the Dharma whisper, every criticism, every challenge, whether of dilution, appropriation, or misuse, is not a reason to abandon modern Buddhism. It is an invitation to go deeper. To reroot in the original intention, to understand suffering, and to end it, not just for ourselves, but for all beings. The Buddha did not offer a religion to be branded. He offered a mirror to see ourselves. A path to walk, not promote. A truth to live, not perform. Perhaps the most Buddhist response to these challenges is not defensiveness, but mindfulness. To see clearly. To acknowledge flaws. To hold even the difficulties with compassion and responsibility. As we reach the end of this journey, let us pause, not to conclude, but to breathe. The question we began with, is Buddhism suitable for modern people? Has led us through ancient teachings, real-life struggles, cultural tensions, digital transformations, and deeply human stories. And perhaps the most honest answer we can offer now is, yes, but only if we live it. Buddhism is not a relic to admire. It is not a self-help method to be consumed. It is a living path, a way of seeing, a way of being, a way of walking through the world with clarity, compassion, and courage. The Buddha never asked us to escape the world. He invited us to engage with it, awake, to the young entrepreneur lost in burnout. Buddhism whispers, you don't have to outrun your worth. Breathe. Let go of the chase. To the single parent, tired and unseen, it says, your love is practice. Your patience is presence. To the activist overwhelmed by injustice, it offers, your rage can become compassion. Your grief can become fuel. To the monk in the cave and the barista in the cafe, the Dharma makes no distinction. It meets each person exactly where they are. Modern life is noisy, fast, fragmented. But the Dharma is still here, still relevant, because suffering has not changed. Nor has the possibility of liberation. The middle way is not a compromise. It is a revolution of balance, between inner peace and outer action. Between solitude and service, between self and other. Many enter Buddhism through ideas, non-self, impermanence, mindfulness. These are beautiful doorways. But real transformation happens in the heart. It happens when a person pauses before reacting, and chooses compassion instead of anger. It happens when a teenager facing anxiety finds calm in their breath, instead of escaping into a screen. It happens when someone loses everything, yet learns they are not their possessions, but their presence. The true Dharma is not found in books or on stages. It is lived in relationships. In resilience. In our quiet willingness to return again and again to this moment, fully awake. Buddhism does not promise comfort. It promises clarity. It doesn't offer heaven tomorrow, it teaches freedom now. And in a world addicted to more, it dares to say, less is enough. Slower is wiser. Silence can speak. In a time when so many feel disconnected, from themselves, from others, from the earth, Buddhism offers reconnection. Not through belief, but through direct experience. It does not ask us to worship. It asks us to look, and when we truly look, deeply, honestly, what we find is not doctrine, but dharma. Not dogma, but discovery. To keep Buddhism alive in modern times is not the task of temples or teachers alone. It is the task of each of us. We keep the Dharma alive by embodying it, in how we listen, how we speak, how we care for those we don't even know. The future of Buddhism is not found in ancient texts or viral trends. It is found in your next breath. Your next step. Your next moment of awakening. You are not too busy, too broken, too late to begin. The path is always right here. There's an old Zen story of a student who asked the master, "Master, what is the path?" The master replied, "Walk." The student asked again, "But where does it lead?" The master smiled, "It leads to where you are." This is the essence of Buddhism in modern life. You don't have to leave the city, the job, the noise. You simply need to return, to awareness, to kindness, to this breath, over and over again, until it is not just practice, but your very way of being. If this video or this message has touched something in you, don't rush to the next thing. Pause, feel your breath. Sense your body. Gently notice, you're here. This is where the path begins, and begins again. May you walk it not with pressure, but with presence, not seeking perfection, but cultivating peace, because Buddhism is not about becoming someone else, it is about coming home to who you already are, awake, whole, and free.